And I think, oh, come on. Yes. Okay, so that seems like that is working. Let's get back to the other window so I can actually see what we're talking about. Oh, and I left it on having the volume. I do not need to hear an echo of myself. All right, so it is 12:01 here on August 30th, and my first point is to offer my support and blessings to anyone who is undergoing the hurricane that is steaming up through northern Florida and on into Georgia and such. If anybody is being affected by that, my heart goes out to you. Hurricanes are no fun, no laughing matter. Please make sure you're taking all proper precautions, listening to the proper information from government authorities, and I hope that everything is restored to normal for everyone as soon as possible. The topic today, however, is nothing to do with hurricanes. It is another agricultural discussion. Now, agricultural is a little bit of a misnomer because what we're going to be talking about is one of the subtopics of tithing. And I bring this today not just because I think the individual psukim verses in Torah are fascinating and worthy in their own right. They always are. But because it provides an interesting insight into the complexities of trying to interpret a passage which may not seem relevant to us mostly, but depending upon the interpretation, can still have very far-reaching consequences and general implications. So, with that in mind, sit back. Actually, don't sit back too far. Lean forward, read along with me. Be on the edge of your seat for asking questions and contemplating this as we dive into Deuteronomy 26, verse 10. So now, here I have brought the premier part of the fruits of the ground that you have given me, Adonai. So this is the very, very end of the phrase that is said by somebody bringing these bikurim, the first fruits that are grown for their fields. Very famously, this whole passage is the rest of the passage. The beginning of chapter 26 is used during the Seder as part of the Haggadah, the retelling of our Exodus. But most of the studies that I've seen usually finish with the actual declaration, but I want to look at what comes next. So once the declaration has been made, what happens? Then you are to deposit it before the Lord, before Adonai your God, and you are to bow down before the presence of Adonai your God. And you are to rejoice in all the good things that Adonai your God has given you and your household, you and the Levite and the sojourner who is in your midst, or stranger, as often is interpreted for ger. So we're finishing up by saying, after you've brought the bikurim, you make the gift, and then you continue to celebrate joyfully. And in that joyful celebration, you, of course, include your own household, as well as the Levite, who don't have a portion of land from which to give such offerings, and the ger, also who would not be in possession of the ancestral land, as they were not a permanent resident. That's the technical definition of a ger in biblical Hebrew. So all of that makes perfect sense. But on the similar topic, when you finish tithing all the tithe of your produce in the third year, the year of the tithe, you are to give it to the Levite, to the sojourner, to the orphan, and to the widow, that they may eat it within your gates and be satisfied. All right, so tithing is very complicated. We've talked about it before. I've done charts before, so we're not going to go into the detail of which year you tithe what and give it to whom. But here, let's just look at the basic structure of this passage, which is that in this tithing, we are giving it after the tithing process. And that timeline is always very important. People sometimes forget that tithing is what comes at the beginning before the produce becomes usable. That the tithing is once you have harvested, you then take stock, you count, you weigh, and you measure all of those good things. And then with that in mind, you now can tithe. You can't give 10% if you don't know what 100% is. So that structure is very important. And tithing then releases the remainder of the produce for personal use. And the tithe, of course, depending upon the year, goes to different designated populations. Okay, so far, probably not that unusual, probably not that strange. But less famous than our initial declaration at the start of chapter 26, where we talk about our first fruits, is also the declaration that comes here with regards to the tithe. And you are to say, before the presence of Adonai your God, I have removed the holy part from my house. I have also given it to the Levite, to the sojourner, to the orphan, and to the widow, exactly as you command that you have commanded me. Exactly as your command that you have commanded me. I have not crossed over away from your commandments. I have not forgotten. So we can see here it's a declaration that is so far very similar to, I swear that I gave the whole tithe, nothing but the tithe, and so help me God. Basically, you are making the declaration, since no one else measured what was in your house. They didn't have official auditors that would go around double checking. You are on the honor system. And that means, like many things in biblical Judaism, when you're in the honor system, you have to make formal declarations, because then you are really putting it in front of God and saying, I swear that this is true. And most people would take that quite seriously. So I swear that I follow the commandments. I swear that I have taken it. I didn't leave anything behind, because if I left it behind and didn't include it in the tithe, then everything is messed up and it's not permissible to be used. And I have given it where it should go. But then we get in verse 14, a very interesting set of specifics that go beyond just the general declaration of I did as I was told. You would think that with verse 13, I did as I was told, that you're covered. But verse 14 tells us you have to make a couple other specific declarations with regards to this tithing. I have not eaten it while in sorrow. Now, that asterisk there in Fox's translation will always tell you there's something more to be said about this. The Hebrew word here is oni. And as we're going to see, it's quite complicated of what that's actually trying to tell us. But that's not the only thing that's complicated here. I have not removed any of it while tameh. Tameh, again, is ritual impurity. I have not given any of it to the dead. And here we have the word mate at the end, which again comes as a slightly unexpected term. I have hearkened to the voice of Adonai my God. I have done exactly as you commanded me. So we got these three very interesting restrictions. Something about being oni, something about the mate, which could be translated as the first as being in sorrow or in mourning. As we're going to see, there are alternatives. And the last one can be translated as being dead. And again, they're all alternatives. The only one that people don't argue about is the idea of not being tameh. Look down from your holy abode, from heaven, and bless your people Israel and the ground that you have given us, as swore to our fathers, land flowing with milk and honey. This day, Adonai, your God, commands you to observe these laws and regulations. You are to take care and observe them with all your heart, with all your being. Adonai, you have declared today to be for you a God, to walk in his ways, to keep his laws, his commandments, and his regulations, and to hearken to his voice. And Adonai has declared you today to be for him a specially treasured people, as he promised you. Be careful regarding all these commandments. And this is the famous phrase, Am Segula, specially treasured people. And as you can see, of course, that is related to our fulfillment of the brit, of the covenant, as embodied in the commandments, in the mitzvot. And set you most high above all the nations that he has made, for praise, for fame, and for honor, for you to be a people holy to Adonai your God, as he promised. Now, we can see that this fits in very neatly with this declaration by Moses, that the people are rejuvenating, repeating, reestablishing, renewing, whichever word you want to use, their acceptance of God's laws, the acceptance of Torah, and that this is an example, not just of what we will do, which is the giving of tithes, but of what we will say while we do it. It's one of the ways that we maintain kavanah, our intentionality, that we're not just doing our taxes, as the 10% tithe could be seen as, but instead are actually doing so as a religious activity. This is a spiritual deed that is being undertaken for spiritual purposes, and that God is present in this seeming bit of accounting. So let's come back then to my question, which is, if we are making this declaration and it is about reconnecting us to God, it is about reconnecting us to the covenant, then all of that conversation of I listen to God, I obey God's commandments, all of that seems perfectly fitting. But why are three special statements? Not just I did what I was supposed to, like verse 13 said, but verse 14's I didn't eat it while oni, I didn't eat it while tameh, and I didn't give any to the met. Why spell this out here when it seems to be redundant and not immediately obvious what the concerns could be? So that is, of course, going to be our focus for our study. But as always, I will pause for a brief moment and see if anybody has any questions they would like to throw on the table about the other portions of this section. Just double checking, nobody is in chat. As always, I will be going back and forth between the YouTube chat window and the Zoom chat window. And please be patient if I happen to delay in getting here. Okay, not seeing anything, so let's go ahead back to our study sheet. Okay, so we're going to start off with Ibn Ezra, and Ibn Ezra is going to give us a sort of common explanation. Indeed, it's the explanation that is used by Fox for this word oni. The word oni, my morning, is similar to the word oni, sorrow, as in Ben Oni, the son of my sorrow, which you'll, I'm sure, remember from Genesis 35 with the birth of Benjamin being described as the Ben Oni. He is the son of my sorrow because in his birthing, Jacob's beloved Rachel passed away. So he, of course, was changed to Benjamin because you don't want to name a kid such a horrible, painful, emotional idea. And then we also know from the book of Hosea that the word onim can mean mourners, as in the bread of mourners. So Ibn Ezra brings some very solid proof text to tell us that this word oni definitely means that this is mourning, so that the meaning of oni is then my mourning. And that is to say, if I was in mourning, that I did not eat of it before setting aside the tithe. So Ibn Ezra says then that the declaration being made there in Deuteronomy 14 is, I didn't eat it while I was in mourning and had not yet set aside the tithe. Now, that, as we're going to see from later commentary, is a little difficult to understand. Just the very short version. Well, but you shouldn't eat of it if you hadn't set aside a tithe anyway. Whether you're in mourning or not in mourning, setting aside tithing is the prerequisite before you can eat from what you have grown. That's what it means to set aside a tithe. And like I said at the very beginning, that's what happens right after you've harvested and measured your produce, is you set aside the tithe. And until you've done that, then you have not released it from being in tithing status. And if it's untithed, it's unusable. So why would a mourner be more suspect in this particular issue? I mean, we already said, I tithed it. If you tithed it, then you can eat it. If you didn't tithe it, you can't eat it. Who cares about your mourning status? So there is a built-in problem already with this translation, just being, I didn't eat it while in mourning. We'll come back to that in more detail, though, later. Neither have I put away thereof. This means neither did I destroy any of that which was holy. So when he says put away or put aside, it doesn't mean like to reserve or save or separate. It means to destroy. And before being tithed, everything is in this bubble of holiness, because we don't know which portion of it is the real tithe until it's been separated. And Ibn Ezra says that this is saying that while it was in that period, I, of course, did not damage or destroy anything willfully. And then, sorry, that should be italicized, for the need of the dead. That's our quote from the verse, and which he means, says Ibn Ezra, well, others say the reference is to idol worship. Now, you're probably thinking, how do we get from I didn't give it to the dead to it's idol worship? Well, these things are enumerated because it is prohibited to use the grain for any purpose before giving of the tithe, which is holy. If he gives from the remainder, he is acting disrespectfully. This is certainly so if he exchanges it for something unclean. As I kept myself and I kept the grain, that is, I removed that which is holy from my house, so may our God watch over our country. This is the meaning of and the land. So Ibn Ezra tries to read it through the rest of it, basically saying that what all of these three statements are is that I didn't give it for any purpose that superseded the giving of the tithe. I didn't give it for anything that was unclean. I didn't give it for anything that was while I was in sorrow, and I didn't give it for an idol. Many commentators on Ibn Ezra point out that this idol worship reference is because idols are dead, and that is the issue here. Not that there would be an issue of giving it to the dead, because after all, dead don't eat. Idols may not either, but the giving of food as a sacrifice to idols, like food was used as a sacrifice in our temple, would have been a more common behavior. So Ibn Ezra is saying these three get spelled out because it is trying to remind us that you shouldn't do anything with the food before you have done the tithing, because if you did so, then what you are tithing from then is technically the leftover. Even if you only took one watermelon out of the mix, technically the tithe is now coming from the leftover watermelons, and well, that is the leftover. And as such, we would be showing great disrespect to be doing it from that remainder. Instead, I didn't touch anything. I did everything exactly right. And just as I did that, so too, God will watch over us and our country. So that's Ibn Ezra's attempt at a plain meaning at this idea. Rashbam, who is known for always wanting to be the master of plain meaning, has a different plain meaning. He argues that the word on is used here in the same sense as in the book of Job, where it refers to the proceeds of robbery. His own hands must give back his wealth. And the word for wealth there is the word based off that same root for own. We also find it used in the same sense in Hosea, where I have become rich, and there in context, the riches derived from robbery. This is the plain meaning of the verse. This is the Peshat, says Rashbam, excuse me. So even though Ibn Ezra quoted Hosea from chapter 9, saying that onim means mourners, Rashbam is quoting Hosea from chapter 12, saying that this own word is actually referring to something that is stolen. And that in this case, we would be reading our verse back in chapter 26, excuse me, mouse took a while to get over there, by saying, I have not eaten anything that was gained by robbery. I have not eaten anything that was gained falsely. And that, says Rashbam, is the plain meaning of this verse. Now, we've got now two different meanings. We've got the idea that I haven't eaten it while I was in mourning, and I haven't eaten it from what I stole, or that I did not steal anything that I am now doing. Those seem to be in conflict, and they seem to be wildly different between the two of them. Well, let's go ahead then and bring in Rashi and see whether or not he has any way to clear this up. I have not eaten thereof in my mourning. From here we may derive that it, that is to say, partaking of sacred gifts, is forbidden to an onan. So Rashi, coming from the Mishnah and coming from Sifrei, is saying that this indeed does talk about while we are mourning. But what it is trying to say is a broader statement that somebody that is in the process of mourning is not allowed to partake of any of the sacred gifts, whether it be the tithing that is to be enjoyed, or whether it be other types of offerings, that during that period of mourning, it is off limits completely. And then to make things even more complicated, when we say I haven't given it for the met, for the dead, Rashi interprets that to mean to prepare for it a coffin and shrouds. Okay, wait, what? How would I use my produce to prepare coffin and shrouds? Well, the basic idea, of course, would be that I would have sold the produce, taken the money from its sale, and then used it for something like a coffin or for the burial shrouds for somebody that was dead. So now we've got a whole host of different interpretations of what those three parts of that verse might have meant. Either I didn't eat it when I was in sorrow, or I didn't eat any holy thing while I was in sorrow, or I didn't eat anything that was from the proceeds of theft, or I didn't give any of it to an idol, or I didn't give any of it to prepare, or didn't use any of it to get money to prepare for the needs of somebody that was deceased. As you can see, it's all rather cluttered in this conversation. Oftentimes we'll have interpretations that are very parallel to each other, but here we have some fairly wide gaps in how this word on, and also how the term met, should be interpreted and applied. So let's go to, not exactly a tiebreaker, but somebody that wants to speak more broadly on this. Rather than giving you one line, they're going to give you, well, a whole page. I have abbreviated Ramban. This is Nachmanides' commentary, because one of the blessings of Nachmanides is that he wrote in full paragraph form, unlike many other commentators that wrote only in notes, single sentence here or there. But of course, the burden of Ramban is that he wrote in full paragraph forms, which means going through it takes longer because there's more to actually go through. But it's a lot clearer when you go through it than some of the notes, because he says multiple things on the same topic, and so it's easier to figure out what he means. So let's go ahead and take first his analysis of Rashi, and then his disagreements. As perhaps you have caught on now from our many visits with Ramban, Ramban often disagrees with what Rashi is saying as his commentary. So let's start with this issue of the dead. That Rashi says this is to prepare a coffin and shrouds for it, for the deceased. This is Rashi's language. But I have not understood this, meaning that doesn't make sense to me. For the Torah explicitly states that we are not to exchange the fruits of the second tithe, which is what we're talking about here, outside Jerusalem, except for coined silver. That we have to take, and if it's too far to carry the produce to Jerusalem, we can change it into cash, yes, but in Jerusalem, we are to spend the money on edible things and eat them before the Eternal, before God. So who would have thought that you would prepare a coffin and shrouds for it? Obviously not. So how would you have asked a person to make a declaration that they have not converted their tithe into cash and bought coffin and shrouds from it, when everybody knows that that's obviously not even close to being in the realm of possibility, because no one would be able to buy anything that wasn't food with the exchanged produce for coin system. So without further elaboration, Ramban is saying that explanation on the face of it seems like a terrible redundancy, completely unnecessary for the Torah to tell us that a person should declare they didn't buy anything for the dead with this. Okay, but then he goes on to try to explain some other opinions that are in more depth, found in the Yerushalmi and then found also in the Bavli. Now I have seen the following text in the Yerushalmi. Rabbi Eliezer said in the name of Rabbi Simai, nor have I given thereof for the dead. Okay, what does that mean? How are we to interpret this? Shall we say that it forbids the bringing of a coffin and shrouds for the corpse, if something like this for the living, a cloak or shirt, is forbidden, need we be told that something which is prohibited for the living may not be done for the dead? So Rabbi Eliezer is raising the question exactly as Ramban is already interpreting it, which I've hopefully elucidated with my intonation, the incredulity of, if I know I can't buy a shirt for myself with the proceeds from the second tithe, then surely I know that I can't buy clothes for the dead with the second tithe. What then is there that is permissible for the living and is forbidden for the dead? It is anointing. All right, so in the Yerushalmi, Rabbi Eliezer is making the claim that indeed this is about not buying things for the dead, but it has to be something that is permissible for the living, that we then have to rule out explicitly by mentioning the dead explicitly in the verse, right? That the verse is coming to teach us something that we wouldn't have otherwise known, which is that nothing for the dead is permissible, because there is something that is right on the edge that is permissible for the living, but would not be permissible for the dead. And that would be anointing. That is to say, special oils that were often purchased to be enjoyed, and they were considered to be something for the body, and thus akin to consuming them, and thus permissible by the second tithe redemption system. So Rambam seems to have a solution, but he's got a problem. But I do not understand this text either. So Rashi didn't make sense talking about coffins and clothes. Anointing doesn't make sense either. For if he anointed a corpse with the oil of the second tithe, he has consumed it in impurity. And he has already confessed that neither have I consumed any thereof unclean. So Ramban's problem with this text from the Yerushalmi is that it is redundant. And I know people complain, they think the Torah is redundant, but really our ancestors understood that the Torah did not waste words. And since back in chapter 26, it says, I didn't eat any of it while tameh, well, you don't get more tameh, you don't get more ritually pure than by touching a body. If you are literally anointing a dead body, then you are coming into contact with one of the biggest sources of ritual impurity, a corpse, very directly. So you shouldn't have to also say, and I didn't anoint the dead, because of course you didn't anoint the dead, because if you had anointed the dead, you would have already violated, I didn't become tameh, I didn't become ritually impure. So it would be redundant, and the Torah doesn't do redundant. It can do emphasis, but even there, we always want there to be some explanation for why the emphasis was needed, what novelty was being introduced. So Yerushalmi does not make sense to Nachmanides either, to Ramban. Rashi didn't make sense, so he continues his pursuit. Please note, by the way, that this is one of the brilliances of Ramban, is that he does not settle for, oh, I heard it taught blah blah, and that's good. If he heard it taught some way, but he doesn't feel that it makes sense, he'll say that. And if he feels even the Yerushalmi or even the Bavli don't make sense, he'll say that. And that's okay in Jewish tradition. Doesn't mean that we violate halacha, but we are, of course, allowed to question and wonder. It could be a shortcoming in our understanding, and that's perfectly acceptable. But we don't have to start with the idea of, I'm too stupid, and therefore they must have a good reason. Sometimes it doesn't make perfect sense, and we are allowed to question and dig deeper. So, digging deeper into the Bavli. And in the Gemara of Tractate Yevamot, chapter Ha'arel, we find Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish said in the name of Rabbi Simai. All right, notice again, we have a different rabbi quoting the same rabbi, which means that there was a tradition passed around from this rabbi of what this all was being used for, and especially with this anointing question. However, we're going to see there is a difference between the Yerushalmi version and the Bavli version. That is par for the course, very, very common to occur, and that is, of course, why the rabbis of the Amoraic period, of the Talmudic period, had to continue to wrestle with the traditions of statements of previous generations to try and understand them, unpack them, reconcile them, correct them if they had become corrupted by the transmission. This is why it was work and why we preserve those discussions in the Talmud. Okay, so what do we see on this topic in Yevamot? Whence do we know that if the oil of second tithe was rendered impure, we may use it for anointing? Okay, wait a minute. Maybe if the oil of second tithe was rendered impure, purely by accident, sorry, pun intended, then it can be used for anointed, then maybe we are coming into a realm of a possibility here. How do we know that? Because it is stated, nor have I given thereof for the dead. I have not given it for the dead, but for the living akin to the dead, I may give it. What use is there for the living and the dead alike? I must say this is anointing. All right, so on the surface, what this section of the Talmud seems to be saying is that indeed I can use it for anointing the dead, but for nothing else. That I can only give it to the dead if they are like the living in some respect, and the only respect in which they are like the living is the fact that I can use the second tithe oil for anointing for the dead if it has become ritually impure, which of course it would be if it was coming in contact with the dead. Okay, so that seems to be what our for the dead is saying. Don't use any of the second tithe for the dead except for anointing. That seems to be from the Talmud what it is trying to claim. Ramban analyzes this. There they have asked, perhaps I should say that this verse is an avowal that he did not buy a coffin and shrouds for the dead. So maybe what it's saying is what Rashi was saying, meaning that I had sworn that I didn't buy anything for the dead. But that would mean that it would be permissible for a living person to buy himself a shirt if the second tithe was rendered impure. Because then, since it may not be eaten, we cannot apply the verse, thou shalt eat thereof before the eternal thy God. To this, the rabbis respond. So let me just walk you through that step. So in the Talmud, it's actually putting a bit of a challenge to this, saying, well, maybe it was talking about the coffins and shrouds, but if that were so, then that would be implying that were the second tithes to become impure, that a living person too could use that to buy himself a shirt or other such things. And that would be because then we would no longer be in the status of, I must eat this in front of God because I can't eat it in front of God if it's ritually impure, so I get to use it for anything else. But to this, the rabbis replied, the verse states thereof, nor have I given thereof for the dead. That is to say, from the very oil itself, meaning I have not used the second tithe oil itself to anoint the dead, thus signifying that if the oil becomes impure, I may still use it to anoint myself. Okay, I know this is complicated, and I apologize for that. Sometimes I just think the complication is worth it. And hopefully you'll agree with me by the end. And if not, pause, rewind, listen to it again, or ask questions in the chat, or you can send me an email later, and I'll try and go over this in more detail. But for now, what they are trying to say is that doesn't really hold that way, because what it's trying to say is thereof, meaning actually from the tithe, that would mean the actual oil of the tithe. And therefore, yes, I cannot use the actual oil of the tithe to anoint the dead. However, if it becomes impure, I may still use it for myself. So thus, it now remains that the avowal, nor have I given thereof for the dead, is attached to the statement, neither have I consumed any thereof unclean. The person avowing that he did not eat from it in impurity and did not use the impure oil of the second for a corpse to anoint it. All right, so Ramban is saying, seems to be that the Talmud is settling down and saying what this actually means is I didn't consume any of it while I was unclean. Remember that important second part of the vow, and that I didn't eat it while impure, of course, and I didn't use the impure oil for a corpse to anoint it. Again, if only for it's only for anointing that we have to have that extra statement about the dead. because we know we can't use it for any other purpose. It's just anointing, would be on the cusp of maybe I can, maybe I can't, because I know that I can for myself if it's ritually impure. And I might have thought that was also the case for the corpse. But no, I can't use it for the corpse because that third line was there in our verse. All right. However, in a Mishnah, we have been taught in accordance with the words of Rabbi Eliezer, as mentioned above in the Sifrei, that nor have I given thereof for the dead means to prepare a coffin for or shrouds for a corpse, nor have I given thereof for the dead, and I've not bought a coffin and shrouds for the dead with it, nor have I given it to other mourners. So the Mishnah seems to explicitly mention the purchasing of shrouds and cloths and giving it to mourners. So we're back kind of to square one. Even though the discussion in the Talmud seemed to come to this resolution regarding the difference between anointing the body and anointing a person, the Mishnah, which predates the Talmud, is quoting quite explicitly this idea that it's about buying things for the dead, like shrouds and coffins. So what do we do? Well, this interpretation, which the rabbis here in the Mishnah deduced that he did not give it for the dead, neither for the corpse itself, such as the coffin and shrouds, nor for his mourners to eat while in mourning, includes his own mourning as well as that of others. Because of the mourning of others, he avows already about the coffin and shrouds, although such uses as buying a cloak and a shirt are forbidden even for the living. So the way Ramban tries to reconcile all of this is to say that one section of the verse is talking about the mourning of others and what a person might have done to provide for them. And the rest of it is also talking about what his own mourning needs would have been, were he to actually be in mourning. So I have not used it for the needs of others in mourning. I have not used it for myself in mourning. I have not used it to buy coffin and shrouds. Altogether, I have not used it to anoint the dead, even if similar anointing would be okay for a living person. So that's the way Ramban tries to bring it all back together. Each verse actually has a purpose. Each part of the verse has a purpose that is giving us additional information that we would lack if that part of the verse was missing. It is not just a useless redundancy. As you can see, it took quite a long time to tease out, but that's what Torah expects from us. It expects that we will ask a question of, well, why are you telling me this when you already told me that? And this seems to be redundant given that, or this seems to contradict that. Then we have to do the work of figuring out how it actually fits all together. It's like if you were building something from IKEA, and you are at the end of the process and you look down and you see that you've still got 3 leftover nuts and bolts, assuming they didn't put extra in the bags, which they might at IKEA, but assuming they didn't, then you better go back and check what you just built, because you've left something out and we can't just assume they're there as leftover. It has to be telling us something, not just extra words to fill up the scroll. Okay. Now, you will find this reinforced here as we go to Rabbeinu Bachya, as he tries to, I hope, put perhaps a clearer spin on what Ramban was trying to say. I wanted to go through the heavy lifting of Ramban because I believe that's always good practice. But let's see if Rabbeinu Bachya can help us sort this out in his way. I have not eaten of it while in a state of pre-mourning. Now, why did they put that pre-mourning there? Well, because the term onen technically in Jewish law is the time period between when somebody has died and when the burial has been completed. So classically, that would be a very short period, maybe the same day, maybe one day. But nowadays it might be a little bit longer, given the greater difficulty in doing a proper burial in the modern world. But that is a special period of halacha. And then the mourning begins with the end of the funeral. That's when Shiva begins, for example, and the counting of Shloshim and so forth. So this Onan period is very much can be considered a pre-mourning, or it might just be mourning in general, as we saw from the earlier texts that were being brought by Ibn Ezra. So, what does Rabbeinu Bachya say? A person engaged in preparing for the funeral of near relatives is forbidden to eat any sacred foods. That's all this means. That while you are in that period of getting things right, you are not allowed to eat anything that is sacred, including this particular tithe. Likewise, and I have not removed or used up any of it while in a state of ritual impurity. That's pretty straightforward. I did not set it aside while I was impure. Now we get to the one that we've been wrestling with most. Neither did I give any of it for a dead person. I did not use it to buy a coffin or other necessities for the dead person's burial from the proceeds of the produce designated as tithes, as we have discussed. The reason that the Torah makes the farmer recite this is that not only did he not use the proceeds from such produce for something merely permitted, but even if he had misused it in order to fulfill a commandment, such as a burial from the proceeds, this is also forbidden, and he has to declare that he has not done so. In other words, one must not appear as if one pays one's debts by diverting funds destined for another commandment in order to do so. The tithes must be used only for food and drink. One must not even buy clothing from the proceeds. All right, so what Rabbeinu Bachya is trying to say here clearly, and one of the main lessons I want you to take away from this discussion about mourners and dead and coffins and shrouds and all of those things, is that when you are in the process of fulfilling a mitzvah, you do not let a different mitzvah sidetrack you. You might think, look, I am in the process of doing tithing, but my neighbor just lost her mother, and I want to help her during this time. So I will take some of that produce, even though I haven't tithed it, and I will fulfill the commandment of helping her during this period. That's not how it works. I know it's very tempting for us to create a hierarchy of mitzvot and say, well, yes, it's true that I'm breaking mitzvah 1, but I am fulfilling mitzvah 2, so that's okay. No, if you have an obligation to tithe, you must fulfill the obligation to tithe, and you cannot even break that obligation to do a different commandment. No more than you could take one of the sheep that were meant to be tithed and offer it as a sacrifice without having tithed from that flock in the first place. That the sacrifice doesn't get you any brownie points with God when you brought it while failing to fulfill a different tithe. Excuse me. This is exemplified, of course, in the argument between King Saul and the prophet Samuel, when King Saul is offering up sacrifices from the spoils of the war against the Amalekites, spoils that were meant to be completely proscribed, which means destroyed, not turned into gifts, and definitely not turned into sacrifices. And as the prophet Samuel says, God does not delight in sacrifices. God delights in our following of the mitzvot, which, as you saw from our text back in chapter 26, is exactly how this whole section is bracketed, that it is about we are engaged in the mitzvot that God has given us, not the ones we like, but not the ones we don't like, but all of them. And that means that we are fulfilling them as they must be fulfilled. Of course, we must still take care of those in need. We must still prepare for funerals, and we must still prepare for mourning, but we don't do so at the expense of actually fulfilling our tithes. The tithes are mandated, just like the taking care of those that are in mourning and taking care of the dead is mandated. One does not supersede the other. We do both. And that is what Rabbeinu Bachya is saying we need to remember. And too often I hear people say, well, Rabbi, I'm engaged in a mitzvah, so it's okay if I don't do something else. And it's like, well, not if it's possible to do both mitzvot. Yes, there are certain circumstances. The old joke, you can't dance at 2 weddings. If one relative is getting married on a day and another relative is getting married on that same day, You are going to have to pick one of them to go to. And that is the case where you can only do one. But if one's getting married on Monday and the other's getting married on Tuesday, then you go to both. And you don't say, well, I went to one, so that's good enough. Both commandments are still commandments. And we can't say I discharged my duty, I paid my debt by taking away from the other. All right, just a couple more from Rabbeinu Bachya, and then we're going to do a little historical detour. I have hearkened to the voice of the Lord my God. I did so when I brought the tithe to the temple. See, I am listening to God's commands. I did in accordance with all that you commanded me. I rejoiced and made others happy with it. This is based on the instruction, you shall rejoice with all the goodness. And this is one of the key features of all of these types of commandments for the tithing, as well as for the different sacrifices, especially those for the holidays, that we are doing so in a way that is not only for ourselves, but is for the community. And that doesn't replace us. It doesn't mean we divert funds, as Rabbeinu Bachya warns, but it means we do include, we bring more in, whatever difficulties that might present. Okay. Now, there is one interpretation that we have not really discussed, which is the idea of preparing the tithing for the dead may just mean actually giving food to the dead. And that was not unusual. Ancestor worship and ancestor support is a common feature of the ancient world. There are still some cultures alive today that practice making offerings to one's ancestors. So that certainly could have been an original prohibition that the Torah was worried about. We know that we're not allowed to scar and mar our bodies for the dead, and we know that other ancient people did. So the mitzvah here may simply have been avoid the burial practices of putting food into the grave or visiting the grave with food for the dead, that these tithes are there for the living, for you to enjoy, and for others that you bring in, the stranger and such, to enjoy alongside of you. And the dead are not the living. That's kind of their defining feature. But as long as we're talking about that historical feature, which I think was considered so implausible by most of our commentators that they didn't even bother to dwell on it, but instead needed to unpack how this worked in practical halakha, since nobody was on the side of putting offerings for the dead, what must it mean for people that were doing other things? There is still the question of, during the mourning period, how one behaves in general. And just as a little excerpt from Josephus's The War of the Jews, there is a little glimpse on this topic. Now, the necessity which Archelaus was under of taking a journey to Rome was the occasion of new disturbances, meaning there was murmurings in the land. For when he had mourned for his father, that was Herod, so-called the Great, because of his building projects, 7 days, and had given a very expensive funeral feast to the multitude, which custom is the occasion of poverty to many of the Jews, because they are forced to feast the multitude, for if anyone omits it, he is not esteemed a holy person. Okay, so here is a real problem that might have impacted on our tithing, that Josephus is reminding us of, that the sages are not. And this is one that has modern implications, even if we're not tithing as well. So here we have Archelaus, the son of Herod the Great, who is trying to become king after his father's death. And he is going through the mourning process, 7 days, as you can see. And in the process, he is giving expensive funeral feasts to the masses, to everyone. So he is paying for a party for lots and lots of people. And then Josephus makes this additional comment and says that custom is actually one that has caused people to go bankrupt, that has caused poverty for many. That people think that if I don't make a huge, expensive feast for all of those that are coming when I am in mourning, that they will think I'm not a holy person, that I'm not religious, that I am not pious, that I didn't care for my relative, that I'm not devout. And thus, people would lay on that funeral feast in order that they wouldn't get a bad reputation. And Josephus is, as implied here, is criticizing this, as has Jewish tradition, that the mourner is the one that needs to be taken care of. The mourner need not take care of those that come to provide comfort. I know that it's become very common in the modern world for Shiva food offerings to become quite extensive. And that is not always easy for many people. And many people will deliberately not invite people to their house for multiple days because they don't feel financially capable of producing that amount of food. Many others will invite people, but will make financially difficult choices to prepare more than they need to in order to impress or not be insulted by those that came. And this is something that needs to be addressed and constantly reminded of. Shiva is about people coming to offer their support to those that mourn. That means when you come to Shiva, ask if you can bring something, and then do bring something. Bring it for the mourner or bring it for the others that have come, but the mourner should not be the primary person having to cover this cost. Now, how does this play into our tithing question and the vow that is made in the Torah? Well, even if one were to say that, of course, I'm never going to offer up any of my produce as a gift to the dead, it might be tempting to say, well, you know, there is this 10% tithing that I could use to put on a more lavish feast for the neighborhood. And if I use that tithing to impress the neighbors, then they will respect me more, or at least not respect me less. And the Torah is trying to tell us here, you don't have to do that. In fact, you cannot do that. You are not allowed to use the tithing in order to impress others with your feast. Instead, do what you can. Let your neighbors, friends, and extended family do the bulk of what needs to be done, and let your tithe be what the tithe should be. That's what you'll declare when you reach Jerusalem. So it's a powerful reminder that stretches for 3,000 years, that in the midst of our grief, we still have to be working hard to make good decisions. And when we go to offer comfort to one who grieves, we need to be very careful that we are not looking down on those who are not providing as elaborate of Shiva goodies for those that come. It is not meant to be a chance to try out a new deli. It is not meant to be a chance to try out the latest pastry creations. It is meant for us to go and sit with those that mourn, to hear the stories of those they loved, to offer them whatever comfort they are looking for. So please keep that in mind, both as a guest in a Shiva house, as well as if you are, as we all will be at some point, in the need of the comfort of others. With that, we will finish for today. So if there are any other questions, fire them off now. And like always, you can put them into the comments on YouTube once this is up and posted, or you can email me, text me, or any other way to continue the conversation. Take care, everyone. I hope again that everyone in Florida and the surrounding states is safe, and that the hurricane is not causing you too much distress. And let's work together to try and mitigate those problems as well.